The galactic predators feared no one, until they clashed with humans. Part 2. First Contact, Wrong Species. War Chief Ugrath had destroyed 41 civilizations. He did not keep that number in his head for pride. He kept it the way a craftsman keeps count of his work, as a record of experience, a measure of competence. He had started his military career as a young Vorakai soldier 500 years ago, which was not especially old for his species, and had risen through decades of campaigns to command the largest war fleet in the Vorakai Empire. He was not cruel for the pleasure of it. He was efficient. He saw a threat or an obstacle, and he removed it. That was all. The 14 ships that appeared at the edge of the Duras system were not a threat. He was certain of that the moment his sensors identified them as human vessels. He had reviewed the intelligence files on humans when they first appeared on the Galactic Council records, roughly 80 years ago. Small species, single planet origin, limited military reach. Their ships were well built for their size, he had noted at the time, but size was the relevant factor. A well-built stone is still a stone. He watched the human formation on his tactical display and felt something he rarely felt in battle: mild amusement. 14 ships. They had come with 14 ships. He composed his transmission carefully. He chose Galactic Standard because he wanted them to understand every word. The message he sent came out in translation as roughly, "Leave now or be consumed. We give you this courtesy because you are new." He thought that was generous. The Pelhari had not received any courtesy at all. On the Ardent, Danny Ortega played the translation for Captain Hart twice. Leon stood with his arms folded and listened to both playbacks with the same expression, which was not much of an expression at all. "Respond," he said. "Tell them we appreciate the courtesy, and we want to discuss the 40,000 people they killed on Duras 4. Danny sent it. There was a pause. Then a sound came through the open channel that the translation matrix identified as laughter. Deep, rhythmic clicking that filled the speakers and bounced off the walls of the bridge. It went on for several seconds. Then the Vorkai fired. The first salvo was enormous. 17 warships, releasing energy weapons simultaneously, produced a wave of fire that hit the Duras system like a wall. Any other fleet in the galaxy, seeing that coming, would have scattered. The training of 63 other species included the same basic survival rule. When facing superior firepower, create distance and protect your core assets. The human fleet did not scatter. Kara Malone had anticipated the first salvo almost exactly. She had studied the limited recordings of Vorkai combat engagements available in the Galactic Council archives, and noticed that Vorkai commanders always opened with a full-force strike. They had won so consistently that they had never needed to develop subtlety in their opening moves. They expected the enemy to run. They designed their opening strikes to maximize damage to a fleeing formation. A formation that moved toward them and split while doing it was something the opening salvo was not designed to handle. The Ardent and the 4 ships of the center group punched directly forward into the gap between 2 Vorkai ships. The left group pulled wide and drew fire from the Vorkai's port side. The right group did the same on the starboard side. It happened in under 20 seconds. Fast enough that the Vorkai gunners had already committed to their targeting solutions and could not adjust quickly enough to fully compensate. Most of the first salvo hit empty space. Ugrath straightened in his command seat. The amusement was gone. He watched the human formation move through his fleet's line and felt his tactical mind engage fully for the first time in years. The maneuver was unusual, not elegant. It was the kind of thing you sketched on paper and made work through aggression rather than precision. But it was not what he had expected. He had expected panic. He had gotten aggression. He ordered his fleet to reorient and pursue. The center human group had already turned. The Ardent led 3 other ships in a tight arc, back toward the nearest Vorkai vessel, a heavy cruiser twice the size of anything in the human formation. They fired together, and the combined strike hit the cruiser's drive section with enough force to knock it sideways. The cruiser did not break apart. It was Vorkai built, and it would take much more than that to destroy it. But it lost speed, lost formation position, and its captain spent the next several minutes just keeping it stable. On the outer edge of the engagement, Lieutenant Commander Pete Garza was doing something that had not been in any plan. His ship, the EDV Copper Run, was a frigate, the smallest vessel in the human formation, and it had drawn the attention of two Vorkai destroyers that had broken from the main fleet to chase it down. Any reasonable commander would have used the frigate's speed to run and draw those destroyers further away from the main engagement, giving the rest of the fleet more room to work. Pete Garza turned toward them instead. He had grown up poor in a city that had not always been kind to him, and he had learned early that the worst thing you could do when something big came at you was show it your back. He did not think of this consciously during the engagement. He just turned the ship and told his weapons officer to pick a target. The Copper Run fired its full weapons load at the lead Vorkai destroyer, at a range that Garza's tactical officer later described in her report as uncomfortably close. The destroyer's forward shields held, but its sensor array took serious damage, blinding it on the port side. The second destroyer, surprised by the aggression, pulled up to avoid a collision, and lost its firing angle entirely. Garza was already moving again before either destroyer recovered. Back in the Vorkai command ship, Ugroth watched his tactical display and processed what he was seeing. In 4 minutes of combat, one of his cruisers was crippled and drifting. Two of his destroyers had been outmaneuvered by a ship a third of their size. His fleet had expended a significant weapons load and hit nothing critical. The human fleet had lost no ships. He had not had a result like this since he searched his memory and could not find a comparison. The last time a battle had not gone as expected, he had been very young, fighting a species that no longer existed, and even then, it had not been like this. That enemy had been larger, better armed, and had still eventually broken under sustained pressure. These humans were smaller, less armed, and did not appear to understand the concept of breaking. He ordered a tactical withdrawal to regroup. His sub-commanders were silent on the command channel in a way that felt unusual. They were experienced fighters. They did not panic easily. But silence, in his experience, meant they were recalculating, and recalculating meant that something had happened that did not fit the numbers they had been working with. He was recalculating too. On the Ardent, Kara Malone pulled up the sensor readings and checked damage assessments across the fleet. Everyone was still flying. The Ardent had taken 2 glancing hits that had burned through some outer plating, but not reached anything critical. Ray Calloway was already in the corridors with a repair team, moving fast and talking to himself in the way he did when he was working hard. Danny Ortega was monitoring the Vorkai command channel with headphones on. Listening to the clicks and patterns of a language the translation matrix was still building a better model of. She caught fragments, confusion, reassessment. She heard a word repeated several times that the matrix translated with low confidence, flagging it as a concept that did not map cleanly to any word in Galactic Standard. She took her headphones off and walked the translation to Leon Hart. He read it, looked at the word the matrix had flagged, and read it again. The matrix had offered 3 possible translations: unexpected, irrational, and, offered with the lowest confidence of the 3, unsettling. Leon set the paper down on the arm of his chair. Let them sit with that. The Vorkai fleet held position 200,000 kilometers away. The human fleet held position too. Both sides ran their numbers in the silence between them, and the silence felt different than it had an hour ago. It had weight now. It had something in it that had not been there before. The Vorkai had not felt anything like it in 10,000 years. They did not yet have a name for it. They would learn one soon enough. The galactic predators feared no one until they clashed with humans. Part 3. The Thing About Humans. The lull lasted 40 minutes. Both fleets drifted in the Duras system, separated by a wide stretch of dark space and the quiet awareness that what had just happened was not normal. On the human side, damage control teams moved through corridors, sealing burns and replacing blown components, and doing the 100 small jobs that keep a warship alive after it has been hit. On the Vorkai side, sub-commanders transmitted status reports to Ugrath and tried to explain, in the precise military language of their species, why 4 minutes of combat had produced results that did not match any model they had. On the Ardent, Leon Hart sat in his command chair with a protein bar and a cold mug of something that had once been coffee, and reviewed the sensor data from the first engagement. Kara sat beside him, working on a secondary console that had a long burn mark across one side from where a power surge had caught it during the fight. The console still worked. Kara worked around the burn mark without comment. "They'll come again with a compressed formation," she said, not looking up. "They want to reduce our room to maneuver. Put enough firepower in a tight enough space that splitting doesn't help us." "I know," Leon said. "So we need to break the formation before it compresses." She pulled up a diagram on the damaged console. "I want Garza to fake a retreat on the left flank, draw 2 of their ships out of position before they lock the formation together. That puts Garza in open space with 2 Vorkai ships on him. Garza will handle it." Leon looked at the diagram. He looked at the positions of the other ships. He thought about the copper run turning toward those destroyers instead of away, and he almost smiled. "Yes," he said, "he will." They finalized the approach in 20 minutes and transmitted it to the fleet. The captains of the other 13 ships acknowledged without lengthy questions. That was one of the things Leon had noticed about the people Earth sent to fly these ships. They understood that in a fast situation, a good plan executed quickly was worth more than a perfect plan that arrived late. They trusted each other. They had trained together, argued together, eaten bad food in the same cafeterias, and now they were here together, and that shared history was doing something in this fight that no amount of hardware could replicate. Danny Ortega was still monitoring the Vorkai channels. The translation matrix had been running continuously since the first exchange, and was building a more complete model of the language with every hour of data. Fragments were becoming sentences. She caught a Vorkai sub-commander saying something to Ugrath that translated fairly clearly. "They are not behaving like prey." Ugrath's response took longer to translate, and came back as, "They are not behaving like any category I have data for." She brought the translation to Leon. He read it and handed it back. "Keep listening," he said. "Everything they say could matter." Danny went back to her console. She put her headphones on and kept listening. She had been doing that, just listening, carefully and patiently, since she was a child. She had grown up in a loud household, with 3 older brothers who talked over each other constantly. And she had learned that the person who listened while everyone else was talking was usually the one who understood what was actually happening. She applied the same principle to Vorkai command channels, and she was building a picture. What Ugrath was experiencing, she thought, was something like confusion, mixed with professional respect, mixed with something harder to name. He had expected easy prey, and gotten a real fight. He had not lost yet, not technically. He still had more ships, more firepower, more armor. But the math that had always guaranteed his victories was not adding up the way it should. On Varen Station, Ambassador Nina Reyes was watching the battlefeed with the Galactic Council. Every species with a diplomatic presence on the station had gathered in or near the main chamber. Some watched in silence. Some communicated rapidly with their home worlds. The Pelhari representative, a thin, elderly being named Osh, who had lost 3 grandchildren on Duras 4, sat very still with his long hands folded in his lap, and watched the human fleet on the display screen. A council member from the Dreth species, a reptilian civilization that had lost a colony to the Vorkai 40 years ago and had never fully recovered, leaned toward Nina and spoke in careful galactic standard. "Your ships are still intact," it said. The statement carried the weight of something it could not quite believe. "Yes," Nina said. "How?" Nina thought about how to answer that. She thought about Leon Hart, and Kara Malone, and Pete Garza, and Danny Ortega, and Ray Calloway, and all 230 people on the Ardent, and the crews of all 13 other ships. She thought about what connected them, what made them move the way they moved, and hold the line the way they held it. "They decided to," she said finally. The Dreth representative was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "That is not a sufficient explanation." "No," Nina agreed. "It never is." Back in the Duras system, the Vorkai began to move. Ugrath had decided on a compressed formation, exactly as Kara had predicted. He brought his 17 ships together into a tight cluster that moved as one unit, reducing the angles the human fleet could exploit and concentrating his firepower into a single overwhelming mass. It was a technique the Vorkai had used for centuries, against every species they had ever fought. A compressed formation meant the end of the battle. There was simply no way to outmaneuver a wall of that much firepower. Leon watched the formation on his screen and said, "Now." The copper run peeled away from the left edge of the human formation and ran. It ran convincingly, not panicked, but with the kind of sharp speed that looked like a ship that had decided the situation was too dangerous. 2 Vorkai ships at the edge of the compressed formation broke away to pursue, exactly as Kara had predicted. Their commanders saw a small, isolated human ship moving away from its fleet and made the decision that any reasonable predator would make. They chased it. They did not catch it. Garza kept the copper run just fast enough to stay ahead, just slow enough to keep the 2 Vorkai ships interested, pulling them further and further from the main formation, until they were isolated and out of optimal firing position. Then, he looped back hard, using the momentum of the run to execute a tight arc, and brought the copper run around to hit the nearer Vorkai ship from an unexpected angle, while 2 other human ships moved to cut off the second one. The compressed Vorkai formation had 2 fewer ships in it now. The wall had a gap. The Ardent went through the gap. What followed was 22 minutes of close-range fighting that no textbook had prepared anyone for. The human ships moved through the Vorkai formation rather than staying at range, reducing the larger ship's firepower advantage by getting too close for their biggest weapons to track properly. It was like fighting inside someone's guard, dangerous, uncomfortably close, requiring constant adjustment. But the human crews had trained for this. They had run simulations at close range, argued about the tactical geometry, built instincts for it over months. The Vorkai had never needed to. By the end of those 22 minutes, 3 more Vorkai ships were damaged, one badly enough that it dropped out of formation. The human fleet had taken hits on 4 ships, with the Ardent carrying a new scar across its upper hull that went deep enough to breach 2 non-critical compartments. Ray Calloway was already sealing them. Ugrath called a second pause. His sub-commanders were not silent this time. They were speaking quickly, and even through the translation matrix's incomplete model of the language, Danny could hear something in the transmissions that she recognized. Not panic, not anger, something quieter and more uncomfortable than either of those. She translated as much as she could and brought it to Leon. One phrase appeared in several of the intercepted transmissions. The Matrix translated it as, "They keep coming." It was not a tactical report. It was something closer to a statement of disbelief, a thing said by someone who had run the numbers 3 times and gotten the same answer, and still could not make the answer feel real. Leon folded the page and put it in his pocket. Outside the window, The stars were cold and still and very far away. The Vorkai fleet hung in the dark, large and powerful, and for the first time in 10,000 years, uncertain. Leon drank the rest of his cold coffee. "Round 3, he said. "Let's be ready." The galactic predators feared no one, until they clashed with humans. Part 4. The Cost of Stubbornness. Ugrath had made a decision. He had been in war for 5 centuries. He had studied his mistakes, and the mistakes of other Vorkai commanders, and built a career on the understanding that underestimating an enemy is the single most reliable way to lose. He had been underestimating these humans. He could see that clearly now, in the same way that you can see a wrong turn clearly once you have already made it. The question was not how to feel about the mistake. The question was how to fix it. His answer was simple: maximum force, no creativity. Compressed formation, full weapons, direct push. No tactics, no maneuvering, no adjustments for what the humans might do. Just raw power, delivered in the largest possible volume at the closest possible range. He had more ships, he had heavier weapons, he had stronger armor. Facts did not change because an enemy was surprising. He gave the order, and the Vorkai fleet moved. On the Ardent, Kara saw the formation shift on her display and felt her stomach tighten. "They're coming straight at us," she said. "No split, no flanking. Just a direct push." "Full formation?" Leon asked. "Full formation." He looked at the screen for a moment. "All right, we hold the line and make them pay for every meter." The third engagement began with a wave of Vorkai fire that was different from the first 2 exchanges. It was not precise. It was not tactical. It was a wall of energy weapons, missile salvos, and kinetic rounds released from 17 large warships simultaneously, aimed at a space in front of them and pushed forward like a moving storm. The intent was not to hit specific targets. The intent was to fill the space the human fleet occupied with so much destructive force that survival became a matter of luck rather than skill. It almost worked. The EDV Vance was on the outer edge of the human formation, a destroyer commanded by a young captain named Owen Cole, who had graduated from Earth's officer program 18 months ago. The Vance was fast and well-handled, and Owen had kept it alive through the first 2 engagements with good instincts and quick decisions. When the third wave hit, he had the ship moving, trying to angle out of the main impact zone. He almost made it. The strike that hit the Vance caught it amidships, the worst possible location, and the energy released was more than the ship's structural frame could survive. The Vance broke apart in under 3 seconds. There was no time for evacuation. No emergency signals. Just a ship, and then pieces where a ship had been. Leon saw it on his display. He watched until there was nothing left to watch, and then he sat very still for a long moment. Kara did not say anything. She had served with Leon long enough to know that he needed a few seconds to carry the weight before he could move again. She kept her eyes on her console and ran the numbers and waited. Leon breathed once, deeply. Then he spoke, and his voice was even and clear. "Adjust formation. Close the gap on the right side. Tell Garza to take the flank." That was all. There was no speech, no announcement to the crew. The bridge stayed quiet and professional and kept working. But the weight was there, underneath everything, and everyone felt it. 73 people, gone in 3 seconds. People with names and habits, and people back home who were going to get a message that would change everything for them. The Ardent took its first serious hit 4 minutes later. A Vorkai heavy cruiser had broken slightly ahead of the main formation and found a line of fire directly at the Ardent's port side. The round that hit was a large kinetic slug, not energy, just mass moving very fast, and it struck the Ardent like a hammer blow, shuddering through the ship from port to starboard. 3 decks went dark. The portside weapons array went offline. 2 compartments ruptured. Ray Calloway was moving before the ship stopped shaking. He had a repair team with him, and he was running, shouting instructions over his shoulder, pulling people toward the damaged sections. He sealed 1 compartment breach in 4 minutes, using manual clamps and emergency foam. The second took longer, because the corridor leading to it was blocked by a collapsed support beam that had to be cut through. He cut through it. On the bridge, Kara was running on backup displays and rerouting systems through secondary pathways, doing 6 things at once, with the calm efficiency of someone who had practiced for exactly this. One of her junior officers was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, where a console had sparked and sent a fragment of casing across the room. He had wrapped it with a cloth from his pocket, and was still at his station. The Copper Run, on the left flank, was fighting its own battle. 2 Vorkai destroyers had locked onto Garza's ship and were pressing hard, trying to box it in against a 3rd ship coming from above. Garza was moving the Copper Run through the gaps between their firing solutions, using the ship's lighter build and faster response time to stay just outside the kill zone. The Copper Run took 3 hits in 5 minutes, each one burning through more of the outer hull. Garza's tactical officer told him the port shield emitter was gone. "I know," Garza said. "Which side are they on?" "Port." "Then I stay off their port side." He adjusted course. Simple. It was not simple. It was very difficult. But Garza had grown up solving difficult things with whatever tools were available. And right now, the tools available were a partially shielded frigate, a skilled crew, and the same refusal to quit that had characterized Pete Garza's entire life. It kept the ship moving, kept firing, kept the 2 destroyers off balance. The Galactic Council feed was being watched across the known galaxy at this point. Hundreds of species, billions of individuals, were looking at the sensor data and the long-range visual feeds from observation platforms in the Duras system. They watched the human fleet fight inside the Vorkai formation at distances that should have been suicide. They watched the Vorkai push forward and the human ships push back, and neither side breaking. Ugroth opened a direct channel to the Ardent. It was an unprecedented moment in Vorkai military history. A war chief requesting personal communication with an enemy commander during an active engagement. His subcommanders noted it in their logs and said nothing. Leon accepted the channel. The translation came through in Galactic Standard. It was not a demand. It was close to a question, and the question was, why do you not retreat? You have lost a ship. You are outmatched in size and firepower. No rational species continues fighting under these conditions. Leon listened to the translation. He thought about Owen Cole and the Vance and 73 people. He thought about Duras 4 and 40,000 Pelhari who had not gotten a chance to make any choices at all. He thought about all the civilizations that had drawn a line on a map and stayed behind it and hoped. He looked at the open channel for a moment. Ask the Pelhari on Duras 4 if they got to retreat, he said. He closed the channel. Kara looked at him from across the bridge. She did not comment on the response. She turned back to her console and kept working. And Leon turned back to his display and kept commanding. And outside the ship, the battle kept going. The Vorkai formation was slowing. Not stopping, slowing. The direct push that Ugroth had designed to overwhelm the humans through sheer force had pushed the human fleet back, but had not broken it. 6 Vorkai ships were now operating at reduced capacity. 1 had dropped out of the engagement entirely. Ugroth's heaviest cruiser was consuming enormous power just maintaining its weapon cycle at this rate of fire, and was beginning to overheat its primary systems. He had more ships, he still had more firepower, but the cost of this fight was larger than any cost he had paid in 5 centuries of war. He looked at his display, He looked at the human formation, battered and reduced, and still holding. He thought about a word he had used in his report after the second pause. Unexpected. He had meant it as a tactical observation. Now it felt like something else. Something more personal. Something that sat in his chest in a way that tactical observations usually did not. On the Ardent, Danny Ortega was still listening. She caught a fragment of a transmission from one of Ugrath's sub-commanders that the Matrix translated with high confidence. The sub-commander was reporting status on his vessel, which was damaged but functional. At the end of the report, unprofessionally, off the formal record, he added 4 words that translated cleanly. They do not stop. Danny wrote it down and kept it at her station and did not show it to Leon yet. She thought he probably already knew. Outside, the Vorkai fleet held position and the human fleet held position, and the wreckage of the EDV Vance drifted slowly through the cold dark of the Duras system. And the battle was not over. And nobody on either side had broken. Not yet. The galactic predators feared no one until they clashed with humans. Part 5. What fear feels like. There is a feeling that comes before retreat. It is not panic. Panic is loud and fast and obvious. This feeling is quieter. It begins in the calculation centers of the brain, in the part of the mind that processes numbers without emotion, and it spreads slowly from there into the rest of a person, or whatever a Vorkai uses in the place of a person, until it sits in everything. It is the feeling of a predator that has pushed into something and found that the something pushes back just as hard, and is still pushing, and will not stop. The Vorkai had no single word for this feeling. They had words for tactical repositioning and strategic withdrawal and calculated disengagement. Their language had been built over 10,000 years of fighting, and in 10,000 years they had never needed a word for this specific thing, because this specific thing had never happened to them. They were learning it now. Ugrath looked at his tactical display and ran the numbers for the 4th time. He had 11 ships still fully operational. 3 were functioning at reduced capacity. 2 had dropped out of the engagement. 1, a destroyer that had taken concentrated fire from 3 human ships during the last exchange, was drifting with no power and would need to be retrieved after the battle. The human fleet had lost 2 ships. 4 more were damaged. On paper, Ugrath still had the advantage. The paper was starting to feel meaningless. He had been in battle for 500 years. He knew what a fleet looked like when it was about to break. He had seen it hundreds of times. The hesitation in the movements, the gaps in formation that opened when crews started prioritizing survival over mission, the communications that became less precise and more emotional. He had broken hundreds of fleets by recognizing those signs and pressing at exactly the right moment. The human fleet did not have those signs. The human fleet was damaged and reduced and had watched 2 ships destroyed in front of it, and it was still moving with the same sharp, coordinated aggression it had shown at the very beginning. If anything, it had gotten more precise, as if losing ships had focused the remaining crews rather than frightening them, as if the grief and the anger had burned down into something harder and cleaner. He did not understand it. He had reviewed everything the Vorkai intelligence files contained on humans. He had read about their history, wars with each other, centuries of internal violence, civilizations rising and falling on their single wet planet. He had read it as the history of a young, unstable species that had survived its own chaos and emerged into space, still carrying the instincts of a creature that had spent a very long time fighting for survival with nothing but its own stubbornness to rely on. He had read it and noted it and filed it away as background information. He was rereading it now, in his memory, and understanding it differently. On the Ardent, the 4th engagement ended as it had begun, with both fleets damaged both fleets still intact, and the space between them full of burnt metal and silence. Leon Hart sat in his command chair and reviewed the damage report that Ray Calloway had sent up from the engine section. 3 primary systems were running on backup. 1 weapon array was offline. The port side had a hole in it that had been sealed but not repaired. The ship was flying and fighting, but it was doing so with effort now, the way a person runs on a leg that has been hurt. Danny Ortega brought him the translations she had collected during the 4th exchange. He read them slowly. There were fragments of sub-commander reports and 2 more pieces of direct communication from Ugrath to his fleet, and 1 short personal message from Ugrath to a Vorkai official back home, whose title translated as something close to High Command. That last transmission was short. The translation matrix gave it with high confidence. It said, "The humans do not fight like prey, and they do not fight like anything we have data for. Requesting guidance." Leon put the page down. Kara was watching him from across the bridge. She had a fresh cut on her arm from a piece of console casing that had broken during the last exchange, and she had wrapped it with medical tape and kept working, and had not mentioned it. "He's asking for orders," Leon said. "That means he doesn't know what to do next," Kara said. "Yes." She looked at her display. "Then now is when we push." It was not a reckless suggestion. She had the numbers in front of her. The Vorkai fleet was consuming enormous power at the rate they had been fighting. Their heaviest cruiser had been venting coolant for 20 minutes, which meant its primary weapons were approaching an overheat threshold that would force a temporary shutdown regardless of what Ugrath ordered. 2 of the reduced capacity ships on the Vorkai left flank were no longer maintaining proper formation spacing, which meant their crews were managing damage rather than executing tactics. They were still stronger than the human fleet in raw terms, but raw strength needs direction to be useful, and Ugrath was asking for direction because he had run out of it. Leon told the fleet to advance. What happened in the next 30 minutes was not a clean or beautiful thing. It was hard and costly, and 3 more human ships took significant damage before the end. The EDV Harriet, a cruiser on the right flank, lost all power for 90 seconds when a Vorkai strike hit its main power coupling, and in those 90 seconds it drifted dark and silent, while its engineering crew worked in emergency lighting to restore the circuit. They restored it. The Harriet came back online and rejoined the line. Pete Garza took the copper run directly under the belly of a Vorkai heavy cruiser and fired everything the frigate had into the cruiser's underside at a range of less than 2 kilometers. The hull of the copper run was close enough to the cruiser that the shock wave from the cruiser's impact damage bounced back and hit the copper run hard enough to knock every person on the bridge sideways. Garza grabbed the edge of his console and kept his feet, and told his helmsman to get them clear before the cruiser's secondary explosion started. They got clear. The Vorkai cruiser dropped out of formation. Ugrath watched it go. He watched the display. He watched the human ships pushing through his formation, the way water pushes through cracked stone, not breaking it all at once, but finding the gaps, widening them, moving through. He looked at his numbers. He looked at the human fleet. He ran the calculation one more time. He made a decision that no Vorkai warchief had made in 10,000 years. He ordered the withdrawal. It was not chaotic. The Vorkai fleet pulled back in good order, covering their damaged ships, maintaining formation discipline. They were professionals, and they withdrew like professionals. But they withdrew. They left the Duras system and moved back across the boundary line on the star map. And behind them the human fleet did not pursue. It held position and watched them go. The silence that followed was very large. On Varen Station, the Galactic Council chamber had gone completely still. Every diplomat, every representative, every observer on the station was looking at the battle feed showing the empty Duras system where a Vorkai fleet had been. The data was clear. The data had been processed through the station's computers 3 times. It was not a malfunction. The Vorkai had retreated. The Pelhari representative Osh sat with his hands still folded in his lap, and the tears that had been in his eyes for a long time finally moved down his face. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying. Ambassador Nina Reyes sat beside him and put her hand over his, and also said nothing. Around the chamber, 63 species processed what they had just witnessed. Some of them had stories, passed down through generations, of the day the Vorkai came, and the options were surrender or death. Some of them had lost colonies, some had lost homeworlds. All of them had lived their entire lives knowing that the line on the star map was the only thing standing between them and a species that had never been stopped. The line had never been enough. Everyone had always known, quietly, in the places where they kept their worst knowledge, that the line was only paper. These 14 human ships were something else. In the Duras system, Leon Hart filed his report. He listed the losses with care and specificity. The EDV Vance, 73 crew. The names would be submitted in a separate document, and each one would be read at a memorial service at Earth Defense Command headquarters. He listed the damages, the needed repairs, the status of every remaining ship. He listed the commendations he was recommending, and the list was long. The final section of the report was his assessment and recommendation. He wrote it in plain language, without decoration. The Vorkai had withdrawn from the Duras system after suffering losses they had found unacceptable. They had not been destroyed. They had not been permanently stopped. They would recalibrate, as all serious military forces do, and they would return eventually. The appropriate response was not to celebrate a final victory, because this had not been a final victory. The appropriate response was to be ready. He sent the report, leaned back in his chair, and looked at the stars. Kara brought 2 mugs of the nutrient suspension that passed for coffee when the real supply ran out. She set one on the armrest of his chair and sat beside him and looked at the stars too. The Duras system was quiet now. The wreckage of 2 human ships was still out there, and it would be for a long time. And that was a thing that could not be fixed by winning. Some costs stay costs. But the Pelhari colony was safe. Whatever remained of it, whatever could be rebuilt. And somewhere on the other side of the boundary line, Ugroth was filing his own report. And in it he was searching for words to describe what had happened. And the words that kept coming to him were the simple ones. They kept coming. They were hurt, and they kept coming. We hit them, and they kept coming. They lost ships, and they kept coming. He did not know what to do with humans. He did not know how to plan for them, or model them, or prepare for them. He did not know what a species looked like when it had decided something and was not going to undecide it, regardless of the cost. He was beginning to understand that this was a new kind of problem. The galaxy had feared the Vorkai for 10,000 years. It had drawn lines and held meetings and sent protests and hoped. It was time now to update the records. Something had changed in the Duras system today, quiet and permanent, the way the most important changes often are. The Vorkai were still large and dangerous, and would not become friendly because of one difficult fight. But they had retreated. And in the long memory of the galaxy, that was something that had never happened before. It would not be forgotten. The galactic predators feared no one until they clashed with humans. Part 1. The Apex of the Galaxy. The Vorkai had been killing for 10,000 years. They were not the oldest species in the galaxy. They were not the smartest. They were not the most advanced in science or medicine or art. But they were the most dangerous thing alive. And every other species in the known galaxy understood that fact the way living things understand fire. Not from books, but from the deep, old part of the brain that keeps you breathing while you sleep. The Vorkai were enormous. Each one stood nearly 4 meters tall, with 8 thick limbs covered in natural armor plating that could shrug off low-level plasma fire. Their eyes were wide and gold, and saw in ranges far beyond what most creatures could process. Their minds were built for one thing above all else: war. They thought in angles and distances and kill zones. They calculated threat levels the way humans calculated grocery lists, quickly, easily, and without much emotion. For 10,000 years, no one had stopped them. The Galactic Council was a gathering of 63 species that met on Varan Station, a large space platform near the center of the known galaxy. They talked about trade, about disease control, about territorial disputes, about the movement of stars. They had committees and subcommittees and long meetings that produced short documents that nobody fully read. They were, in most ways, a typical government. But on one subject, the Galactic Council had no debates, no committees, and no long documents. On the subject of the Vorkai, they had a single policy, written in plain language, that every member species had agreed to without argument. Draw a line on the star map, stay on your side of it, and pray they stay on theirs. For a long time, that had worked well enough. Then, the Vorkai crossed the line. Duris 4 was a colony planet belonging to the Pelhari, a quiet species of thin, pale beings who had been farming the outer rim for about 3 centuries. They were not warriors. They had no significant military. They grew food, raised families, built small towns with wide streets and colored lights, and traded their harvests across 4 nearby systems. 40,000 of them lived on Duris 4. They had been living there long enough that children had been born there who had never seen their species' homeworld. The Vorkai arrived without warning. 17 warships, each one bigger than most human cities, dropped into the Duris system at dawn. The Pelhari colony had 6 hours. The distress signal they managed to send before the end was picked up by a Galactic Council relay station 2 days later. The Council held an emergency session on Varan Station. There was a great deal of talking. There were expressions of sorrow and anger and fear. There were proposals and counter-proposals, and arguments about what could realistically be done. Several species sent formal written protests to the Vorkai, which the Vorkai ignored entirely. The session went on for many hours and produced in the end a resolution condemning the attack in strong language and calling for a peaceful and immediate withdrawal of Vorkai forces. The Vorkai did not respond. In a smaller room off the main council chamber, Ambassador Nina Reyes of Earth read the resolution and said nothing. She was a short woman with dark eyes and the kind of face that did not show much of what was happening inside. She had been a diplomat for 20 years and had learned a long time ago that the most important part of diplomacy was knowing when words had already run out. She sent a single message back to Earth. It contained the full situation report, the sensor data from the Pelhari distress signal, the coordinates of the Duris system, and a short note at the bottom that said, "The Council will not act. Recommend Earth makes its own decision." Earth made its decision in under 6 hours. Captain Leon Hart received his orders on the bridge of the Earth defense vessel Ardent, 3 days out from the Duris system. He was a tall man, lean, with short brown hair going gray at the sides, and a habit of standing very still when he was thinking hard. He read the orders once, handed the tablet to his executive officer, and told the helmsman to plot the fastest course to Duris. Lieutenant Commander Kara Malone read the orders and looked up at him. She was sharp-eyed and direct, the kind of officer who said what she thought and was usually right about it. 14 ships, she said. That's what we have in range, Leon said. The Vorkai sent 17. I know how to count, Kara. She handed the tablet back. All right, she said. Then we need a plan. They spent the next 3 days building one. Kara worked at her console for long hours, running simulations, studying what little recorded data existed on Vorkai combat tactics, looking for patterns. She drank too much bad coffee and slept in 4-hour blocks and covered the secondary console in handwritten notes. Leon reviewed everything she produced and added his own thoughts in the margins. They argued about 3 of the approaches and agreed on a 4th, which Kara sketched out on an actual piece of paper because the display screen was showing an error she did not have time to fix. The sketch showed a 3-group formation split, with the outer 2 groups drawing fire and the center punching through. It was aggressive. It assumed the Vorkai would not expect anyone to move toward them under fire. Kara called it the Broken Arrow. It had no official name in Earth's tactical library, because Earth had never needed to fight anything like the Vorkai before. The rest of the crew knew what they were flying into. Word had spread through the ship the way it always does on small vessels, quickly, quietly, and completely. The Ardent's crew was 230 people. Some of them were very young. All of them had chosen this work knowing that it carried risk. But knowing something and standing inside it are different things. And in the 3 days before they reached Duras, people found their own ways to sit with what was coming. Ensign Danny Ortega, the communications officer, spent 2 evenings reviewing Vorkai signal structures, memorizing the frequencies they used and the way their transmissions were structured. She was 24 years old and had been on the Ardent for 18 months. She told her bunkmate that she was not scared, just focused. Her bunkmate, who had known her long enough to understand the difference, said nothing, and let her be focused. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Ray Calloway ran 3 separate diagnostic checks on every system and then ran them again. He was a big, quiet man who talked to the ship's systems the way other people talk to pets, murmuring instructions and updates under his breath. He had been keeping ships running for 16 years and had never once had a ship fail under him. He did not intend to start now. On the final night, before they reached Duras, Leon Hart stood at the forward observation window for a long time and looked at the stars. They were beautiful and cold and very far away, and they did not care at all about what was about to happen. He found that strangely calming. Kara came and stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Do you think they'll be surprised?" she asked eventually. "Yes," Leon said. "Good," she said. "Let's keep it that way." The Ardent and the 13 ships flying with it dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Duras system the next morning. The Vorkai fleet was waiting on sensors, 17 massive shapes hanging in the dark. Leon looked at the numbers, checked the formation, and straightened up. "Open a channel," he said. Nobody on that bridge was shaking. Nobody ran. They sat at their stations and waited. And the thing that moved through the room was not fear exactly. It was the particular human feeling that comes right before something hard, when you have already decided to do it, and the only thing left is to begin.